Dr. Atchison here, and we're going to finish up Chapter 3, the visual brain. This is our third video, functional areas, pathways, and modules. Okay, so functional areas and pathways. Connectivity patterns are these major functional pathways for specific types of information. And a pathway specifically is what it sounds like. It's a pathway. It's a pathway of neural connections, though, instead of a sidewalk here, involving lots of axons and different areas that transmit this information. And different kinds of information go down different pathways, okay? And that means they go to different areas of the brain that are specialized for processing those kinds of information. Functional pathways, again, are connecting the areas of the visual cortex, and they can be compared according to 4 different characteristics. The first of time is the kinds and types of neurons and how they're distributed within them, okay? So they're going to be organized a little bit differently, and they're going to have different kinds of neurons in them. This will help us distinguish between different pathways and different functional areas. The second characteristic is the other areas of the brain which they're getting signals from or they're sending signals to. Okay, so who are they connected to? What parts of the brain are they talking to? What parts of the brain are talking on this pathway? Where are the stepping stones, essentially? The third characteristic is what are those constituent neurons? What are they tuned into? What are they paying attention to? What properties are they interested in? So are they interested in motion? Are they interested in the direction of motion? Are they interested in differences in color? What properties are these neurons interested in? And the fourth is that each of these visual areas contains a renotopic map of the visual field. So again, we're going to have that same property of renotopic mapping that we talked about in the last video. We're going to see in this idea of functional pathways and functional areas. There's thought to be at least 30 different visual areas in the brain, and they're organized into a kind of a rough hierarchy. Okay, and your book goes into a lot more detail about some of this hierarchy than we're going to go to, and goes into more about the pathways than we're going to go into, and it goes into more about the modules than we're going to go into as well. But there's this kind of rough hierarchy that this comes first, and then this, and then this. And again, this hierarchy refers to the order in which areas process information coming from the retinas. So when we talked about area V1, we talked about the primary visual cortex. We said that that was the first stop in the visual cortex. That means that the visual cortex is higher up in the pathway than other kinds of things are going to be, okay? So this is higher in the hierarchy than maybe V4 will be or MT will be when we talk about them, because that's the first stop. So that's, again, higher in that hierarchy. And some of these visual areas can be further subdivided. This is not a neuroanatomy class, despite the first 3 chapters. So we're not going to go into all the detail that's present here. This is essentially a perception class. The first chapter was to set the stage for perception. The second 2 chapters were to set the stage for vision. And the next chapter, we'll really get to go into more about perception. But this is so that we understand the mechanics of perception. So we won't go into all the details that are there in your book. Okay, so the 2 main pathways that we are going to concern ourselves with, you are not having to concern yourself with Table 3.1 in the book, talking about the different kinds of RGCs and that level. We will talk about the different pathways at the end of Table 3.1, but not the different kinds of visual areas and the different layers that are going through to get there, okay? So these 2 main pathways that we're going to talk about are the dorsal pathway and the ventral pathway. The dorsal pathway, and to remember which one's which, a dorsal fin on a fish or on a dolphin or on a whale is on the top, right? It's on its back. So it's on the top, so your dorsal pathway is going to go more towards the top. That's the way I remember which one's their dorsal pathway. It's going to be like my dorsal fin, okay? And this is the where or the how pathway. And the way this one typically works is, again, we start at V1 because that's higher in the hierarchy. And then we'll go into V2. From V2, we'll go to MT, which you can see here is this little green area. And then from from MT, we'll go into the parietal lobe. Remember, that's just above that occipital lobe. In this graph here, it's this blue area. And what we see, the kinds of information, remember we were talking about different pathways are characteristic of the different kinds of information that they're processing. On the dorsal pathway, we'll see things like object motion is going to be on the dorsal pathway. We'll see location, information about an object's location is going to be on the dorsal pathway. Guided action is going to be on the dorsal pathway. The ventral pathway is the what pathway, okay? It starts in V1 and V2 too, just like the dorsal pathway does, because again, of this hierarchy, this is the first stop on the train is V1, which is why it got a whole video to itself. And then we'll go into V4. From there, we'll go into the inferior temporal cortex. And like we said, some of these areas can be broken up into more sub areas, okay? The inferior temporal cortex is one of those things, okay? So that name sounds big and scary, but if you think about it, the temporal cortex is, again, that one behind your ears, behind your temples, and the inferior temporal cortex is that lower part of it, okay? Because it's inferior is one way, again, you can kind of think about it. It's the lower part of that cortex. You can see it's that bottom ridge there. And again, here we have a different kind of information is being processed here. Things about color are going to be processed here, shapes, places, objects. This is about object's identity. Are you a person or are you a thing? Is going to be on this ventral pathway. So now let's talk about some of the areas that are in these dorsal pathways versus in the ventral pathway. So area V4, which is in that ventral pathway, is really important for color perception, and it's really important for perceiving curvature of edges, so rounded edges, the curves of edges. And so here we see area V4 here, and so it's that dark pink area in that visual cortex. MT is this green area here that we talked about. This is on the dorsal pathway, and this is really specialized for motion perception. And again, these are kind of the first two stops on either the ventral or the dorsal pathway after we leave V1 and V2. So we radiate out from V1's the yellow in the center, we go to orange in V2. On the dorsal pathway, we'll go next into MT, which is that green area. On the ventral pathway, next we'll go to V4, which is that dark pink area. In the lateral occipital cortex, and the inferior temporal cortex are these complex shapes, okay? So the lateral occipital cortex is this purple area here, and the inferior temporal cortex is, again, that bottom part, and that's why I've got such a big circle. It's because it's shown in two pictures here because it's shown from two different angles, that bottom part of the temporal cortex. And again, this is really responsible for complex shapes. This can be natural objects, it can be human artifacts, and again, this inferior temporal cortex is going to be further broken down into more modules. And remember, this idea of functional modules comes out of that idea of modularity that we talked about in chapter 1, where different functions are happening in different areas of the brain. So within that inferior temporal cortex, that bottom of the temporal cortex, we have areas such as the fusiform face area, and this is specifically for what it sounds like, faces, and it's used for recognizing faces. And I did assign you a YouTube video to watch about the fusiform face area, and we'll talk about it more in later chapters, but it's a really interesting area of the brain, so let's kind of start talking about it early. And another area that we see is the parahippocampal place area. In this picture, the fusiform face area is this purple area. The parahippocampal is this green area. In the parahippocampal, we're processing landscapes, buildings, rooms. So again, its name tells you what it does. It does places. So the fusiform face area does faces. The parahippocampal place area does places. And again, these are more large scale kinds of things. The interparietal sulcus, so it tells you in its name that it's in the parietal lobe, and it's so it's kind of in the middle of the parietal lobe. This is where we do visually guided action. So grasping, you can, the information that's seen in grasping, reaching for a particular object. These are how our brains, where our brains process this kind of visually guided action. So to be able to see what you're grasping, to be able to see what you're reaching for in a particular direction, this is happening in the interparietal sulcus. So again, if you are reading chapter 3, we really glossed over a lot of that. And that is because, again, the book is going into more complex details than we're really going to need as we progress forward. So this may be a little bit deeper, including those launchpad activities is how deep we're going to go. But remember, the book's going in a little bit deeper than we are. Okay, so this is the end of chapter 3. I'll see you next week.